Tonight, it's my great honor to introduce Nick Cave, an artist, educator, and messenger working between the visual performing arts and fashion worlds through a wide range of media, including sculpture, installation, video, sound, and performance, and much, much more. Nick is well known for his body of work described as sound suits, and I'm sure he'll share that with you tonight. Sound suits in fact, there's a sound suit in our current exhibition that you can check out, so please do that. These works are sculptural forms based on the scale of his body. Sound suits camouflage the body, masking and creating a second skin that conceals race and gender, but allows the viewer to experience individuality. And if you don't know Nick's work by now, you'll experience that in a few minutes. He is described as a Renaissance artist. Nick's solo exhibitions have taken the world by storm. In addition to creating his masterpieces, he is a professor at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. I have to be careful what I'm going to say up here. Anybody from Missouri here? He is the recipient of major awards and honors, and Nick recently opened an exhibition called Until. That exhibition is now on view at Mass MoCA, which uses thousands of found objects and more to explore important topics of today. This is a project that we are particularly interested in, and I will save that for later because Chad and Nick are going to talk about it. Maybe share a few secrets, but maybe not. Joining Nick in a conversation tonight is our own curator of contemporary art, Chad Allagood. And Chad, you want to get us started?
Hi, everybody. This is a very special evening here at Crystal Bridges, not only because Nick Cave was a part of Crystal Bridges' collection and was indeed on view the day we opened over 5 years ago now, but also because this is a pivotal point in Nick Cave's illustrious career. Wow. Hey, Nick.
Hi.
Welcome to Arkansas. So perhaps a good way to start this discussion, in the context of what we've just seen, the intersection between the performative and these sound suits. The film that you made in Detroit really makes that connection explicit. When you arrive in Art of American Dance, and this is the last object in the show, I mean, it really wraps up the entire experience for the viewer. It suggests movement, but of course, it's not moving, right?
Right.
How do you navigate that in your practice?
Well, it is moving. I think, I think it's nice that in this particular exhibition, which is really great, by the way, I think this is really about, it ends with this sort of conclusion that it's all sort of, you come to this sort of static object, but yet there is this sort of notion of imagination, imagining how it perhaps moves and what that sort of entails. But then I also think there's sort of movement and sense of sort of dance within the way in which the objects are sort of placed and operating around and on the body, so that, it's static, but it's sort of this sort of evolution of activity that sort of surrounds the body. It's the energy.
It implies a kind of movement. Mm-hmm. And for you, I mean, you talk about the aesthetics. You come out of a fashion background. You have connection to, the retail world you were talking about earlier, and yet it's not just a pretty object. I mean, these objects exist in a very real context. What kind of context is this film emerging out of for you?
It's really, it's me sort of thinking about, how do I want to position myself in the world as an artist? And I think for me, it's really about uh, how can I sort of use art as a way of establishing myself and providing a service. So it's really about that for me. It's really about how can I sort of serve and sort of find purpose within that, and sort of getting amongst communities that sort of really need to be sort of enchanted, transformed, initiated in a sense. So it's really me sort of doing the work that I want to do as a civic kind of duty in a sense.
A civic duty, a sense of purpose, a kind of support. These are big themes, and they're big aspirations for art. Big aspirations. And so, to put a finer point on it, when you were collaborating with Cranbrook in the context of Detroit, what was it about that context that inspired you to work within the context of that community?
Well, I think, when I went to Cranbrook, the sort of interesting and some disturbing thing was I was the only minority there. So I was really like sort of in a state of shock. Cranbrook is so isolated and sort of really sort of away from an urban sort of environment that I sort of was accustomed to, and thank God for Detroit.
That's right. So Bloomfield Hills, of course, is a mostly white suburb, 18 miles north of Detroit.
Yeah.
It's so close and yet so far.
And so, I needed Detroit. Detroit was my balance. I needed Cranbrook and I needed Detroit in order for me to sort of stay at Cranbrook. And so it was really my way of sort of giving back to a city that really provided me the resources and the support that I needed while being in grad school at Cranbrook. So, and when I was offered the sort of solo exhibition in Cranbrook, part of my mission was that I would accept the show only with the opportunity to work in Detroit and sort of engage in community work with young people, and that's really where I sort of find to be the most exciting place for me to work, is when I'm sort of working, when I'm again sort of working with people and sort of bringing people along on a journey or through an experience.
And when you reflect on that experience with this one or in previous work with the community, was there something that surprised you about, because it's one thing to just sit in a studio and to make your art and then to push it out into the world in a crate. It's quite another to go to the community itself and to talk to people and to collaborate with them and to listen. What did you take away from that experience?
It's very different each time, but I think for me it's sort of doing sort of a lot of the lead work up to building these relationships. It's me sort of going to a city and spending time in the city and sort of getting into the drenches and who's here. And if you meet one dancer, you're going to meet 50 dancers. If you meet one musician, you're going to meet 50. And so I was able to I'm interested in that. I'm interested in introducing a city back to itself. You'll be amazed how many places we've worked in, musicians, performers that don't really even know each other and never have even met and maybe live in the same block. And so that's real. I'm interested in bringing a project to a city, but hiring the city to build the project. So that's really what it's about. I don't know. I'm going in blindsided at the same time, but that's really kind of the only place that I feel that I can work. Sort of, I just sort of fall into the abyss of the fear and just kind of handle it.
And that abyss of fear is what opens at the beginning of a project. But of course, after you sort of make that initial meeting with the community and become a kind of stakeholder in that place, there are things that have to be made, right? I mean, your practice is very material in the way that it functions.
And we pretty much make all of that in studio, but it's like, when we need 60 dancers, if we need 20 musicians, vocalists, then that's where it all starts to sort of shape itself. And again, I'm looking for, the best dancers, the best musicians, the best vocalists, and I'm looking for people that really have sort of been out there, but have not really had a break, and there are ways in which I can sort of help facilitate moving their careers further, and it's really, it's my project, but it's their project, and at the end of the day, I just have to make sure that we sort of reach a place where
this place.
Well, sometimes I feel like that, but no.
So that whole collaborative exercise, which comes forward both in the conception of a project, but then also the associated programming, performances with musicians and dancers. The studio is also another site of collaboration for you, yes?
What do you mean?
Well, so it takes a lot of hands to make the things happen. Could you say a little bit about your process?
The studio, it fluctuates, I have a sort of a staff of 10 that are regular, but then it can go up to 40 assistants depending on the project. And it's really sort of me assessing what's coming down the pipeline and how do I sort of facilitate a studio that really allows movement to sort of happen, and it's very organic. I'm not really one for sketching and drawing. It's sort of we just sort of make things, and I have an idea, and that's how I sort of, I'm always thinking. I've been here for about maybe 6 hours, and I was just sort of, again, sort of processing some new ideas.
Yeah, you've already thrown some out at me, yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure what, it's not that, there are things that are set, but may not have been, we may not have started developing and making them, but I know clearly what they're to be, and it's really sort of, that's kind of done, that work is done, and I can kind of just keep sort of thinking and
it's almost like a composer with a musical score, right? So a composer creates a musical score, and then every time that score is played by a different set of hands, it can emerge in a kind of different way.
Yeah, like with the performance work, with the studio work, it's all sort of spontaneous. It's very sort of, there's a lot of improv that's happening, but it's really kind of, and I think the only way that I can get here is just, it's through exercise, it's through sort of understanding the vocabulary of methods of making and really sort of knowing this sort of broad range, because I'm working across the board between sculpture, performance, video, installation, Bunny Boy there.
Evil bunnies, yeah. So as sort of improvisational as your practice is, there is a kind of intensive manipulation of the hand that happens too, and a very particular usage of, as Rod mentioned earlier, would seem to be found objects, but then also materials that you're sourcing from elsewhere. I wonder if you could say a word about how you choose your materials, where they come from, and what do they bring with them?
When ideas sort of come about as I'm sort of, antiquing or flea marketing. So like, me and Bob will jump on a plane and fly to Washington State and rent a cargo van and drive back.
I got to take you to a couple places in Rogers. They're great places to go.
And so on our way driving back, we just sort of pull out our phones and we just sort of look for the antique malls, and so that's how we resource. And it's really just the object. There's an impulse and something that I find that may just like send me into this crazy mind space, and that's the beginning of new work.
And then you bring that back to the studio and elaborate around it?
I bring it back to the studio. I may not know what it's going to be, but it's somehow there's a pulse to this theme.
A pulse.
There's something that is, that sort of that's alive, that speaks of options, and then in some cases I may build. What I'm finding what's happening right now is that I'm building the work on site. So we may be at a flea market. We were at a flea market once. Bob said, "Look at this ceramic dog, seated dog," and it was. I looked at him and I don't know. I'm not feeling it. And he goes, "Oh, you must feel it because it's perfect." And so I was like, maybe. So then I sort of, spent a little more time with it. And then I said, I need to find a Go settee. And he's like, okay, like, where? And I said, we're going to find it on our outings. And did we find it? We did find it.
Of course you did.
But the interesting thing is that, we're looking at this Go settee and we're talking about it, and I'm talking about how I want to use it and how it's going to be sort of incorporated in the work. And and the salesperson's standing there and we're like, can we bring in our dog? And so they're like, okay, sure. So then Bob gets this ceramic dog and we sit it on the settee, and it just started to everything just sort of came together. But, it's, it's that kind of I can look at something, I know what it needs to support it, I know what it needs to, in order for it to sort of come together. It's, I see the larger picture, and I'm just building and keeping it very loose and organic and fresh.
And it builds towards something. I love what you said about the object having a pulse. And it returns me to what we talked about earlier with respect to the sound suits, this anticipation that they might move, the sense that they could come alive. They, even though they are inanimate objects, you're waiting because there is potential in it.
And I think it's about potential. I think that you don't necessarily have to sort of tell the whole story. You can I think that space of imagination and curiosity is really, really important. And I think I don't want to give all the information, nor do I know it.
That's right. And because some of the information is in the hands of the audience.
And none of the work is ever completed anyway.
Yeah.
Fully.
How is it not completed?
I just sort of wait until it sort of has it has a heart. It's sort of like, there's a moment in my practice where it's like I can remove the ventilator and it can breathe on its own, and so it's done.
And then you walk away.
Sure.
Yeah. And so I want to talk a bit about what it can do then. Because once you walk away and it assumes its own life, it goes out into the world, and sometimes you don't see it.
No.
For years.
Right.
Or ever. I mean, you walked
Forever.
into the gallery today and you saw a sound suit that you hadn't seen for what?
5 years.
5 years. How did that feel?
Well, it's, I think it's interesting when, I know that I made it. I
Check.
mean, but,
Provenance.
I think that I think that's the sort of beauty about, being in the studio, is that, I'm building a body of work, but, I think that's what the messenger thing comes into play, that it's not really for me. So I'm just the one chosen to sort of deliver these deeds. And so when I look at it, it's like, I think, is it interesting? Am I excited about what I'm seeing? And for the most part, it always is. But I'm sort of like removed. It's like, I know that it came from that world, but I'm not. But it's, you know, it's in the studio and it's out of my studio so quick. I document it, then it's just sort of, the work is pretty much out of my hands and it's gone.
And you
So-
you talk about yourself as a messenger too, and I want to push on that a bit because the messages that arrive from your objects. Wait, before we get to that, what's this from?
This is an invasion that we did in Chicago. You know, every now and then I may just surround up a group of dancers and we'll just invade something. And it's really just about that kind of intersection. It's not that we are like, you know, I think I'm learning. I think outside the studio, that's where I learn about the work. So why not use the world as a canvas and sort of put it out there and see how it reacts and what happens. So it's that kind of, I'm interested in that my sort of sketch pad could be in the middle of this room right now.
Oh my gosh, that seemed like a cue. The thing I want to press on here is that when the work exists outside of the safe confines of the museum or the gallery, when it goes into an invasion mode, it can't help but interact, reflect with the context, the society in which it is viewed. And here I want to be very specific because your work has been interpreted as the sound suits as disguising the form, almost as a protection. And indeed, in the film that we just saw, it was almost as if the bodies of these young urban participants were shielded, that they were almost in armor. What's that about?
Well, you know, I think, you know, the sound suits, you know, they really are about hiding gender, class, race, forcing you to look at something without judgment. You know, so it's this sort of this other hybrid that, you know, we tend to want to sort of categorize things in order to understand them. And here it's really, you're confronted with something other. And how do you sort of come to that? And what does that mean? And how do you sort of open yourself up to accepting what you're encountering? So it's really about that. It's also about empowerment. It's, you know, those young kids that were, you know, that was the Ruth Ellis Center. Oh, speaking of the piece, there it is right there.
Ceramic dog in the settee. Yeah.
You know, it's about concealing and revealing. It's about me protecting myself. It's about, you know, me sort of also sort of, you know, what do I need to do to sort of take charge and to be sort of proactive and sort of be a participant in for change and how do I sort of operate in this sort of space of leadership and authority, and how do I sort of, and also I'm talking about ideas of adornment and how do I sort of remain relevant? How do I sort of, you know, what do I need to do to condition myself to sort of maintain an understanding of the world?
And there are ways of concealing, of protecting, of disguising that aren't so damn beautiful, right? So your work is manifestly gorgeous. There was a moment when one of the figures spun as he walked down the ramp, and the whole thing came to life. How does beauty work in that context?
I think for me, beauty is sort of my sort of seductive mechanism. It's a way in, but I think once you're in, it's very dark. I think the work's very dark.
It is very dark.
But the facade of it is not. So, and I think that's really how we sort of operate in the world. I think there's lots of discouraging, despairing things happening in the world, and we cover that all up with, you know, fucking reality TV and sort of shutting our doors and, you know, pulling down our blinds and sort of shutting away from all of that. And, you know, I'm sort of trying to find ways to sort of take you by the hands on this sort of journey through this process and to sort of create sort of spaces for conversation about difficult sort of issues. And
For me, that takes us to a place, and Megan, if you could shift to your latest project, which Rod mentioned at the beginning of our discussion, which is entitled Until. It's a large-scale, massive installation at the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art, which is in North Adams, Massachusetts. And in short, it has been described as a journey into the belly of a sound suit. But in point of fact, it's quite a bit more than that. So take us by the hand, as you so beautifully do,
Through it.
and tell me, first of all, why Until?
well, the project sort of came about when Denise Marconish, the curator at Mass Smoker, came to my studio about 3 years ago and sort of offered me this project at Mass Smoker in their largest space, which is the size of a football stadium. And the only thing she said is, she goes, there's only one sort of request, and that is I don't want any sound suits. And I was like, yes. And
A liberation.
and I was already sort of working out of that and moving on anyway. But, and then she said, I will come back in 1 year. We didn't talk, we didn't communicate, and she came back in a year and asked me what did I want to do. Well, a lot can happen in a year. And so what was really happening in that year was really just this sort of, and it's been happening, just this sort of gun violence and sort of, these, what I was focusing on is just the number of unarmed black men that were being sort of shot and murdered by police, and it just really sort of was very troubling and disturbing for me. And as I'm in the studio working, I'm listening to NPR one day, and they're talking about Ferguson, and they're also talking about Brown, and so I'm working and I'm thinking, and then just one day, the idea of is racism in heaven sort of entered to my mind. And so that really was the catalyst for Until. And Until it came out of guilty until proven innocent, or innocent until proven guilty. So that's how that title sort of came about. The show opens up with this particular piece here, which is this cast of my arm and hand, and the position of the hand is if I was holding a sort of a pistol, that's the position that the hand would be in. And so it's a piece titled Unarmed. And so it opens up the show with this sort of narrative about the show. And then let's go to the next image here. And so this is what you walk into when you walk into the space. You walk into this sort of, and let me just sort of step back a second. And I wanted to sort of, when she told me no sound suits, I thought, okay, then I want to put you into the belly of a sound suit. So this is me putting you inside of like what's going on inside of me. And so you're immersed in this sort of intense, elaborate kind of experience that goes on and on. So you then sort of enter the space. There is this sort of sea of garden spinners, which are some are just general garden centers, butterflies, flowers, and they are all moving. But then there are guns, bullets, targets, teardrops that are custom, that are also incorporated within this sort of moving kinetic sort of forest. And so the front is also this reflective sort of pool of that sort of experience. But the reason why I chose these spinners were that what is going on in the world right now around just the sort of gun violence and the sort of the outrage around it. It's really in our backyard, and so that spinner really is symbolically speaking of, something that's really sort of very sort of understated, and that's where we find these objects, and so
They're mundane, they're everyday, they're part of our lives, we ignore them.
Yeah,
and
they're- exactly.
In their massivity, in their accumulation, they assume a greater prominence.
Yeah, and so as you're walking through this, you enter the space and you're blown over with just, this sort of wow and beauty and this fantastical sort of sensation. And then you realize that there are guns and there are targets and there are bullets and there are teardrops. So the disparity just comes over you quite quickly. But then somehow within there's this sort of sense of optimism that's also sort of moving amongst that experience. And
It
so
comes from the wonder, I think. I mean, the wonder of walking into a space and being aesthetically overwhelmed by what you see. And you activate that in a number of ways, and you activate it too in the...
And so as you sort of move through this sort of kinetic sort of spinning field, you will then come to this crystal cloudscape. So this is elevated 18 feet in the air, all out of crystals, and the ladder structures are these portals to the top of this sort of crystal cloudscape, and above that is this sort of amazing sort of forbidden sort of typographical sort of garden made from metal toll, and living within that sort of space are about 18 lawn jockeys that are holding these amazing sort of beaded dream catchers. Also in the garden is this sort of swine of pigs that live in there, and there's this huge gator. But it's really sort of, again, these letter structures also sort of, it's me sort of looking at the clouds and these rays of light that passes through. So it operates in two levels. But, so this is the piece that sort of came about for Is There a Racism in Heaven? So that's what I created, illustrating that. And as you keep moving through the installation, you then come to this beaded mountain sort of range, all constructed from pony beads, but it's really sort of operating in this way where these could perhaps be traps, these sort of nets that sort of can sort of restrict one's movement, motion.
They entice you, but they could entrap you too.
Yeah, and then they're sort of tattooed and sort of covered throughout in these sort of what I consider tagging. And then as you move through this space, you then come into, you actually pass through it into this video installation titled High Dive, which is a immersive video installation that sort of operates the entire room and the floor. Sitting in the center of that piece is this enormous sort of lifeguard chair that goes all the way to the ceiling and continues to the top of the installation, that then leads into this piece titled Flow Blow. And so this is...
There's the top of the chair there.
And so this is Mylar that is blowing, and it's called Flow Blow, and
There are industrial fans backing each of these. This is, 20 feet wide?
yeah, and about 12 feet high. And you really don't know that the text is there until you photograph it on your phone. So you really don't know the word flow is even in the piece.
And how does this function for the viewer?
And so for me, this is really sort of, after going through that sort of journey, it's really this sort of place where I find that it's really sort of cleansing and sort of, just sort of trying to sort of wash away the disparity but not to get it confused, you have to go back through to get out.
So once you've been
So-
cleansed of that experience, and once you reach your resolution, you have to turn and face the journey
Yeah.
again.
Exactly.
And so those structures of culture that you're reminded about all the way through, the absolution that comes when one event is over is not a total
No.
absolution at all.
Right.
And
And also, the space is also operating as a convening space. So throughout this installation, there are a number of locations for performance activity. So we will be releasing in January the entire performance programming, which, it will be a number of sort of high-profile artists, from musicians to choreographers, that will be operating in the space. But it's also a space for community leaders to have convenings and school groups to talk about these issues of race and gun violence. And so it's really sort of me creating a sort of a safe haven, a place for difficult conversations to be had. And, yeah. And so this is when you sort of come back out. So this is looking at the back wall.
so you've mentioned the extension of performance into this practice, the continuation of community engagement, which really, activates this space in a really meaningful way. You now are just processing the experience of having opened this enormous space, pushing your practice in new ways, working with large-scale installation at a scale that is a first for you, and not many artists have had experiences like this, in fact. So you're processing this now. Is this a direction that feels open to you? Where will you go now?
Yeah, I'm not sure. But yes, of course it will. It's like, this is the largest space I've worked in, but I think everything prior to that has led me to this sort of opportunity. So this is definitely a place that I want to sort of continue to work, because it serves both purposes. It is sort of allowing me to sort of create an amazing sort of artwork, but then it's also allowing me to sort of share it with the world, and for the civic work to be sort of operated within it. So it's doing exactly what I intended to do. And I'm not sure what's next. I'm thinking about things, but I'm always thinking about things.
Oh, yeah,
and-
you are. Well, though you may not be sure what's next for you, I can tell you what's next for Until. So this installation will be up at Mass MoCA through August of next year, after which it will travel to Carriage Works in Australia, large-scale, beautiful space. And after that, it will come to Crystal Bridges. We are, along with Carriage Works and Mass MoCA, we are incredibly proud and honored to have helped to co-produce this work. And working with Denise, who had that gem of an idea to collaborate with you and to bring this thing to fruition, we are excited and honored partners on this project. And so thank you for spending the time with us this evening. And we will leave time for 3 questions from the audience.
But I have a question for
Yes.
you.
Yeah, before we get there. Go
A
ahead.
question for you. So you were at the opening.
Yes.
You sort of didn't know, well, you maybe had an idea of what I was doing, but you didn't.
You can't know it until you're there.
And so when you were there, what was the experience like for you?
It was overwhelming and emotional because the space on the evening that I attended was activated by people, first of all, who are ready for this experience, but also by the amazing performers who
Yeah.
were in the space that
Brenda
evening.
Wimberly and
That's right.
Sarika Henderson.
Yes, both of them.
Fabulous.
Filling the space with this sort of soulful, improvisational, mournful but triumphant kind of tone. The sense of momentousness, the wonder at the surface of the objects, and the great pleasure to be in the middle of something so beautiful and so important. Yeah, it was something I won't forget.
Okay, great.
So now that you had your question, only 2 are left. No, we can have,
Exactly.
we'll take 3 questions from the audience.
Right over here.
Your work is extraordinary, and it's just incredible.
Thank you.
One of the things I'm really struck by is the combination between how and I think the words you use are kind of enchanting and magical, and it's got that quality, but yet there's elements that around race and gender and class that resonate really deeply and are really, really solemn. And yet, to the point that you made, it's that your message about race is really positive. And I think right now, with what's happening in the world, how do you feel? Do you intend your message about race and about gender and about class to be positive now? Do you intend to inspire people around that? I'd love to hear you just talk about what you're hoping to accomplish there.
Well, I think, the amazing thing about this particular project that I think changes my sort of platform is that, when I'm working with my gallery in New York, Jack Shaman Gallery, shows are up for 3 weeks at the most, and so a lot of people can't get to it. Here, this is up for almost a year, and that is the difference, that this is up for a year. There's programming the entire coming year, and as of right now, their attendance has tripled since the show has opened. And I'm more interested in that than this, this piece, because, again, as a messenger, this was my assignment, so I have delivered the deed. And so I'm interested in now, how does it sort of work? How does it become activated as a place for us to sort of gather and have these conversations and to be proactive and it has to do this without me being there. But what do I how do I create something that becomes a draw and that can pull people to Arkansas and how do we sort of program around that, and how do we sort of get engaged within the community and sort of reach out and do what we need to do to be part of the change. And so I'm interested in just sort of creating that kind of space for those sort of holistic kind of things to happen. And it's my motivator, everything that's going on.
Question on the other side.
Hi. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the balance that you find with being a professor at SAIC and being the sort of caliber of artist that you are, and the sort of endeavors that you take in these sort of large-scale exhibitions, how you balance all of that, and then maybe talk a little bit about the art of teaching and how it infiltrates your work and vice versa.
Yeah, sure.
Well, just a note about that before you answer the question. So Nick is known across the field as prioritizing teaching as a critical part of his practice. And indeed, we have the time that we have with him based on his teaching schedule. And we're so, I so honor that you prioritize that first before the rest of it.
That's my job. But, for me, it's, I'm interested in, the future. I'm interested in, the next generation of artists. And I sort of, I'm sort of eager. I'm like crazy about the students, even though most of the time they're like a disaster. But it's like, but I'm interested in, it's like when we select grad students to come into the program, I rarely really sort of, I look at all the work, but I mostly select students that the work can be a hot mess, but there is this hunger and there's a fearlessness there, and that's what I bring into the program. I'm just interested in this kind of edge where, I can sort of help shape and bring the best out in you. And, what really matters to you? What do you want to talk about as a young person? And how do we sort of find methods of arriving to that place? And so, yes, I'm very hard. But if you're working, I am not hard. If you're not working, I am very hard. And really, it's about sort of building a trust. How do we get to a place where you know how to trust yourself? It's School of the Art Institute of Chicago. It's a 2-year program. It's in the fashion department. 80% of the students don't even do fashion. I don't care if it's fashion, if it's sculpture, if it's performance, video. Because I sort of work across all these boundaries, and I sort of really my hands are in these sort of mediums, in these fields real deep. And so, it's really sort of me, I have 2 years to get you in shape, to get you for your thesis to develop a body of work, professional work. It's very different than the other work that happens in the studio. Moving it into a professional sort of practice, it goes from here to here. And so, we have the fall semester, we have the winter intensive, which is 4 weeks of just studio. You don't have any other classes. And that is like changes your life, because when you're working every day, oh my God, it's so incredible. And I like to see, one reach revelations, and I know when it's difficult. I've been there myself. I was a grad student once too, but I know what it takes. And so, that's part of what I can bring into the classroom. I take them on amazing study trips. We do Miami Basel, but then we also we spend time in the design sort of industry down there. We spend time in artist studios, in fashion houses in New York. We do the same thing in Europe, the same thing. So not everyone's going to be an artist, but there's all of these sort of amazing sort of avenues that you can build an amazing sort of lifestyle within the arts. So it's really about providing that, offering that, and creating an amazing thesis at the end of the day.
One more.
So, they're glad when I'm gone because I'm on them 24/7, but they are like, can't wait till I get back at the same time out of fear. But I know that feeling because I was like that in grad school too, like, oh my God, he's gone, yes, I can relax. But then it's like, oh, I need him to sort of respond to this work. And so it's that sort of thing. And, you just, with the grad students, I want them to know that, I co-teach with another professor and that we have your back. It's tough, but you know what? You fall, the first day I know what you can handle, each person, based on their delivery when they sort of do their 15-minute presentation. So we just sort of know right away what we're dealing with. It's interesting because when we have these 15-minute reviews, looking at everyone's work, me and my sort of co-teacher, we go into the office and this never fails. We're like, what? Like, did we really select this group? Like, oh my, but it never fails. That's the first thing we say, like, oh my God. But, but then we have to understand that we chose them under different circumstances. And, a slick portfolio doesn't mean that it's very deep. So.
One more question.
Right in the back?
Okay, I'm an artist, and something that hit me really hard about what I just saw you talk about with your exhibit is that it's a journey through you as a person and the inside of you, and that's actually what my thing that I'm immersed in my own work is about right now. And there's a lot of vulnerability that goes into that, and so I was wondering if you could give any advice on how to prepare yourself for that kind of vulnerability and exposure when you finally get it out into the public.
It's a great question.
I think once it gets to that place, getting it out to the world, I think that, that vulnerability is you've taken care of it in-house. I mean, I'm like a disaster in the studio most of the time, crying, trying to work through it, and that's really where it happens. You've got to sort of be willing to sort of come to terms with some truth. And I think that once you've done that and you've sort of built this body of work, then you can release it. So I think it's really sort of in-house.